Hello, everyone, and welcome to our first introductory lecture on Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. So, before I go into Frankenstein, I shall try to talk about the issues which propelled such a text. And among such issues, there would be certain personal issues, certain age based issues, and so on and so forth. Now, always understand that each text has a poetics and a politics. And if you ignore the one, you in turn ignore the other. That is true of every text. And also remember that each text is a product of its times. Now, its greatness lies in transcending those times. So, let me first locate the text in its times, in its climate, and then we shall see that how it has had afterlives and so on and so forth. But first things first. Now, when Mary Shelley talks about Frankenstein, she writes, but these philosophers, whose hands seem only made to dabble in dirt, and their eyes to pore over the microscope or the crucible, have indeed performed miracles. What kind of miracles was Mary Shelley talking about? First, we shall look into that. Now, Mary Shelley was born on 30th August 1797 and died on 1st February 1851. And in these 53 years of her life, she had a very eventful life. And some critics have gone to the extent of saying that she embodies the very romantic movement of England. She was survived by her son Percy Florence Shelley, who was named after his father, the poet Percy B. Shelley. And why am I talking about her son? Because that will be one of the major issues over here. Now, Mary Shelley was living at a time of political, social, scientific, and cultural upheaval, and all of these have great influences on her masterpiece Frankenstein. Now, if you try to question that how did a teenager think of such a work such as Frankenstein, which created a genre in itself, you will have to take into consideration the fascinating influences on her life as well. The novel was first published in 1880, and it was to dominate the entire literary legacy left by Mary Shelley, just as the monster had a lasting impression on the creator, Victor Frankenstein. Now, Frankenstein gave Mary fame, even though not fortune, and it was recognized as a literary classic of English literature as early as 1831. And it is often cited as the first science fiction novel. But apart from the fictionality of the science fiction, there is a lot of scientific argument which goes behind the creation of this book. Basically, there have been multiple sources which have influenced Mary Shelley and her creation of a character like Victor Frankenstein and the monster. Now, coincidentally, we must mention that Frankenstein is not the monster, but Frankenstein is the guy who creates the monster. And why have we come across such a misconception and such a misidentification that we will come to later in this series of lectures? Frankenstein takes about 9 or 10 lectures. So, if I have the time according to your syllabus, so I will give 9 or 10 lectures on Frankenstein. because it is a fascinating novel. And I read it when I was still in school, and I was fascinated by two novels, especially Bram Stoker's Dracula and Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Later, I came across Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu's Camilla, and that also fascinated me. So, this genre of the gothic, of the mystery, of the early science fiction, of the horror, etc., they kind of have influenced me a lot. So, without talking much more about myself, let's try to understand that how Mary Shelley kind of created a puzzle of such diverse political, social, scientific, cultural, economic, and so on and so forth influences, and created a masterpiece out of them. The ideas or the precepts that Mary Shelley explores in the course of Frankenstein are very simple. The basic ideas, the rudimentary ideas, they are very simple. That is science, life, and responsibility. So these are the fundamental concepts that Mary Shelley talks about. Okay. And if you look at the time in which she was writing, as I have already mentioned, that every work of art is actually located in its own time. So if you deny the times, you cannot quite understand the text. Now, these are the three issues which were predominant in the age she was writing. Now, the 18th century is known as the age of the Enlightenment in Europe. Now, this is a time when prominent thinkers began to examine and to ask questions, to posit questions, not only to the religious orthodoxy of the time, but also the political principles, the scientific understandings, and in general, how the universe works. So basically, this period was one of social, political, religious, economic, cultural upheaval. Now, one method in which society can be developed upon, it can be improved, is education. That is, increasing knowledge. Now, the philosophy which concerns itself with knowledge is called epistemology. Okay. Now, in Enlightenment, there was a philosopher, a German philosopher, whose name was Immanuel Kant. As early as 1784, so long before Shelley's birth, Immanuel Kant writes an essay. What is the title of the essay? What is enlightenment? And this essay, What is Enlightenment, poses the very question in its title. And the answer that Kant seems to provide is sapere aude. What does sapere aude mean? Basically, when Kant says sapere aude, he means by it the spirit of enlightenment. That is, dare to doubt, dare to question. Now, Kant suggests that by enlightenment he means mankind's emancipation from self imposed immaturity and unwillingness to think freely for oneself. Now, therefore, we must understand that the enlightenment in its principle was a principle of questioning the age old established ideas. For instance, let me give you an example. If today we perceive we perceive the same rules which applied, say, 200 years ago, the same rules. That is, whenever somebody had cholera, they would leave in India, they would leave those villages and move away from those villages to stop from getting cholera. But today we have medicines, then why should we migrate? Similarly, what Kant suggested in essence was that every age must find for itself its own answers. And this is specifically what Mary Shelley was doing for herself. Okay, now if you look at the first 17 years of Mary Shelley's life, Britain and France were in a continuous warfare, and the rulers of both the countries and also of many countries of Europe were trying to consolidate their power, and many people tried to become the sole source of government over vast areas or vast regions and vast numbers of people. And some rulers were so influenced by the Enlightenment ideas that they sought to improve their own subjects. Now, these people were seen as the enlightened despots. And at the turn of the 18th century, under the rule of Louis XIV, France became the artistic, cultural, and political leader of Europe. But also, the systems of government in France was copied by other monarchs. Now, the fashions, the architectural styles, even the court of the king. And French became the common language in diplomacy as well as in scientific discourse in the following century. Now, Louis XIV was succeeded to the throne by his grandson, Louis XV, and it became apparent that the transfer of rule meant the end of the rule, and the political strategies employed by Louis XIV came to a stagnating halt in the rule of Louis XV, marking an end of the growth in intellectual ideas as well as in other fronts of art and culture. Now, many French philosophers contributed to the creation of something magnificent, that is the French encyclopedia. The encyclopedias, which were published between 1751 and 1772. Now, it was the collective endeavor of not only philosophers but from experts of different fields. And these contributors varied from, say, engineering to science to medicine and so on and so forth. And it is a 28 volume work which is complete with 70,000 articles, 70,000 plus articles, and more than 3,000 illustrations are there. Now, this encyclopedia, why am I mentioning this? Because the root cause, the spirit of creating this encyclopedia was to change the way people think. And this great compendium of knowledge, of enlightenment ideas, had spread its influences all over Europe. And if you look at it politically, the political upheaval was not there only in Europe, but it was also in America, and it was spread sporadically between the indigenous colonies of France and of Britain. Now, there were certain agreements made with these indigenous peoples for the division of land. But the French, in effect, were financially and militarily ruined. And the war had doubled Britain's national debt. So, what happened was that to recoup some of the losses, new taxes were levied on the countries, and the Americans they became very hostile towards a distant foreign government. And incidents such as the Boston Tea Party in 1773 raised tensions, and in 1775 the revolution began. Now, it resulted in America as emerging as an absolutely new nation in 1783. The attention to America as the newfound land, as the new country, also became a spotlight event, and it brought with it several other issues, such as the treatment of the slaves brought from Africa to America and to other British colonies to work. And the Shelleys primarily deplored the slave trade. And Frankenstein has often been seen as a commentary on slavery through examining the treatment of a race of humans who are visibly different from us. Now, the wars in America had an impact in France as well, and the defeat and the financial cost had weakened both the monarchy and the government. As a result of the spread of Enlightenment ideas and the huge social changes, there was an increasing attention to examining how a society treats its fellow citizens. Now, in France, while these same ideas had taken hold, the aristocracy had effectively blocked social reform and kind of hoarded up their own privileged positions. Also, the nature was not in their favor as well. Poor crop yields, increasing disparity between the rich and the poor, and many, many other factors led to a bloody revolution very soon. And in 1789, we know about the French Revolution, which led to the later Napoleonic Wars, and we know the history of how that ended in a very devastating waves of repercussions through Europe. Now, the French Revolution transformed the French society as well and moved it towards a more democratic and secular government. The authority of one group of people over a majority, and simultaneously an unquestioning allegiance given by the majority to a very small group of people on the basis of something as fragile as the divine rights did not apply anymore. And a set of new principles were established called Code Civil de Francais. And in this Code Civil de Francais, certain precepts were laid down which are observed till date in France. Now, this upheaval in the civil law influenced the legal systems not only in France but also in Italy, Germany, Belgium, and Netherlands, which were the surrounding countries of France. Now, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen gave greater freedoms and protection to people of different faiths, of different color, of different sexual orientation, of different gender, and all kind of differences that you can name. Now, these things which happened in America, which happened in France, changed actually the political map of Europe very surely. Now, the liberal democracy was taking its hold globally. Now, as we have seen that the 18th century brought changes in the political aspects and in the geographical aspects as well, because new countries were emerging, old countries, old maps were becoming invalid. But it was not only a geopolitical change, but it was an intellectual and cultural change as well, because for the first time, man was tilting towards science instead of religion. And the medieval preconception of epiphanies, of divine revelations, were no longer acceptable, and rather, people were seeking a more secular way of understanding the universe in terms of laws which were universally acceptable. If a law applies for me, it should apply for somebody in Ghana today. It should apply for somebody in Copa America today. It should apply for somebody in Nigeria today. It should apply for somebody in, say, Russia today. So that's the thing. They needed one universal law. And this marked the tremendous progress in science. And basically, science not only altered its space, but it altered its methods. That's number one. Science gave a greater precedence to experimentation and experience as valid methods of knowledge production. Now, you see the Greek tradition, which was being followed up till the 18th century, the 17th century. This had a great limitation. That is, it was based on lucid narratives rather than experimentation and experience. And you have all read about the uh, four kinds of humors, the humor theory, and it was humored upon, literally, because the Greek well made narrative was no longer acceptable by the 18th century people. And this Greek tradition of kind of well written narratives instead of science was very, very visible, very, very apparent to the new scientists. Secondly, people like Isaac Newton actually came up with mathematical formulations through which the planets, heavens, stars, etc., can be marked. That is their position, their movement, how far they are, etc. So, time and space was no longer under God's own domain, but it started to become available to man as well. The celestial spaces, the terrestrial spaces, the extracelestial spaces, etc., etc., etc. So, this speciality, this temporality, that is how far we are, that is where are we, where do we come from, where are we going, these questions were mathematically and mechanically exposed by Newton, and God no longer was the prime mover, the initiator of all that we see. Instead, it was some natural law, some universal law. And if you follow Newton's mathematics, every time you do it, the answer remains the same. So if something becomes an anomaly, there is a scientific explanation for it rather than it was God's will. It was like God didn't have a good breakfast, and so he decided that, okay, let those two planets clash. It's not like that anymore. So people were seeking logic instead of fantasy fiction behind whatever is going on around us. Thirdly, the Enlightenment implemented instrumentation, that is, different forms of devices, different forms of gadgets, etc., were being designed, built, and utilized. And in Newton's mechanical universe, God was either a mathematician or an instrument maker, nothing more. So, while what happened was that the 18th century was challenging the world as we know geopolitically, it was also not silent scientifically. And the known world was shrinking at a rapid pace because the periphery of knowledge was expanding at almost a very, very fast pace. And the different trades with different countries because of colonialism brought back exotic goods and fantastical, far fetched tales back to Europe, such as the Arabian Nights, such as the several myths about Cibola, the several myths about El Dorado, the several myths about India, where rubies are being found, and so on and so forth. So, what happened that rulers realized that trade was the best way to bring much of the money which is needed into the countries. And the Dutch, the French, the British, the Portuguese, everybody set sail. And exploration of the distant lands, this becomes a major theme in Frankenstein as well. That is, the novel is framed within Walton's scientific expedition to the North Pole. The North Pole was a completely unknown space till then, and a source for many of the 18th century fantastical tales of the natural philosophers. And no one knew if the top of the world was land, ice, or open sea. And proposed expeditions to the Arctic hope to increase some form of scientific knowledge. For instance, why does the compass needle show an attraction? As well as they believed that if they went to the North Pole, then there were certain economic benefits which were to be gained. As the explorers pushed further and further into the new continents, the newer territories became fewer to the cartographers, and they had lesser problems in filling up the blank spaces of the maps. Now, man's dominance over the globe is perhaps exemplified by a series of scientific experiments which were conducted between 1797 and 1798. And the scientific genius, whose name is Henry Cavendish, basically he was a pinnacle of this scientific exploration. Now, the availability of increasingly sophisticated instruments particularly aided both the natural philosophers and the uh, explorers, like telescopes, microscopes, and numerous other devices which were designed and developed. Uh, and the astronomers looked beyond the Earth. The scientists found new planets, Uranus, and other comets in the solar system, and distant stars and nebula were observed and catalogued. Basically, what was up till now considered to be heaven was now mapped, pinpointed, and mathematically defined. Now, basically, At the beginning of the century, science and philosophy were, what should I say, inadequately defined. And with the progress of the Enlightenment, science became the fashionable philosophy of the day. That is, the talk of every educated person, every well to do person was science. And coffee houses in London buzzed with several recent discoveries in far flung parts of the world. And an intellectual rigor, a new intellectual rigor, kind of manifest itself in the scientific investigations. And importantly, new discoveries were disseminated to a wide variety of audiences through lectures and printed works. And there were even workshops, there were even uh, you know chat groups who would come conduct experiments together. And in 1801, the Royal Institution opened its doors to allow the general public to attend lectures on the latest scientific discoveries. Now, audiences and readers were encouraged also to simply not just learn about science, but to do experiments themselves, as I was saying. And the philosophy of the English Enlightenment encouraged everyone and anyone to participate in further discoveries and discussions. And pamphlets and books were sold at very low prices so that they could become very, very popular. And even the scientific equipments like microscopes, telescopes, chemistry sets, electrical devices were sold in London in sales so that the people could afford them very easily. And created, this kind of destroyed rather the barriers between the scientific disciplines of the time, the different scientific disciplines of the time. And therefore, geology, anthropology, engineering, medicine, astronomy, you name it, all of these areas came together and they formed the basic scientific principles of the time. And chemistry, which was, for instance, chemistry, which was long associated with just the chemists. In the late 18th century and in the early 19th century, it moved from being a collection of phenomenal series of discoveries, which was just a simple collection of facts and experimental results. Chemistry became one of the major philosophies, and it started influencing physics. It started influencing the other forms of scientific principles that we know today. And in this regard, Newton was very important because he had paved the path for it. For example, uh, that story which was associated with Newton, the entire apple falling on him, which was connected with the story of gravity itself. Now, uh, therefore, it became very important that fact mingled with fiction, where the fictionality could not take over the fact. The fact still was more important. And during this time, several chemical properties of several elements were found for the first time, like phlogiston, which was an interesting fluid, uh, which was thought to be there in every substance in greater or lesser extent, was proposed as the cause of burning. And Antoine Lavoisier basically thought that it was the presence of oxygen that gave some compounds their acidic properties. Now, the increased rigor that had developed in this age either substantiated these theories or substituted them. But what happened was that Lavoisier, P.A. Simon, Laplace, and all of them, they developed a new system of chemical naming which brought some order and showed connections between elements. And Up till now, where there was chaos, up till now, where we divided several elements, now we started connecting the dots between them, and nothing remained isolated, everything was connected. So, as these new discoveries were being made, a whole host of new things, such as lands, planets, peoples, elements, manufacturing techniques, scientific processes, etc., all of them demanded new names. And this naming took on a huge significance. For example, Lavoisier named oxygen, which meant producer of acids. Now, this is encapsulated in his theory behind elements and how he believed that they combined between each other and they combined with other substances as well. Now, when new branches of science emerged and practitioners of those experiments defined themselves by their work, we see that people like Benjamin Franklin, Joseph Priestley referred to themselves as electricians. Sir Humphrey Davy, Antoine Lavoisier, they were identified as chemists. However, these identities were fluid, and in the 18th century, Franklin could simultaneously be a statesman, a printer, and a natural philosopher. Priestley could be known for his political, religious, and educational writings, etc., etc. But none of these people, not even Mary Shelley's Victor Frankenstein, would dare to call them the name scientist. I know it's surprising, but as surprising as it may seem, the word simply hadn't been invented yet. It was a meeting of the British Science Association in 1833 where William Wellwell, William Wewell, Whewell, William Wewell proposed almost jokingly that since they worked with those arts, primarily those who worked with arts, they were called artists. So therefore, those who engaged in science should therefore be called scientists. So it was a joke, but it was a few more years just, in which the term, the joke, actually worked, and people started calling people of science scientists. And what happened was that with so many developments by the chemists in finding out the elements, the term element itself was reassessed and redefined. It was no longer the four elements like earth, water, air, fire. That was no longer the four elements. Basically, the term element was being questioned, and that was specifically what Immanuel Kant was trying to do. In this lecture, I am tracing the element, the enlightenment. Sorry, not element. I have been talking about elements for so long that every time I see EL, element comes out. Uh, but I'm talking about enlightenment in general. So, what happened in this period is that everything was questioned, and everyday substances like water, like air, they completely changed their identity. And water was not water anymore, it was H2O, two molecules of hydrogen, one molecule of oxygen. And it was not an element in its own right, as believed, as long as mankind might think of, as believed, as long as antiquity itself. Now, such people like Sir Humphrey Davy, who was a researcher and lecturer also at Royal Institution, the status of chemistry as a subject was raised to much higher levels of importance. And chemistry was becoming a professional occupation and a requirement for those who were studying medical and other scientific areas like engineering, geography, agriculture, etc. So you see, the several different areas are now being connected, and it is this connection which is so very important over here. And it is therefore no surprise that Mary's character Victor Frankenstein took a course in chemistry when he enrolled at the University of Ingolstadt. Now, since we have been talking about science so much, uh, I can just simply go on talking about it. And I think I'll make one more video on enlightenment as well, on the other issues. Now, driving a large part of the scientific discoveries in chemistry was electricity. Like scientists in the 18th century had completely re-evaluated the electrical phenomenon. At the start of the century, the static electricity was the only form of electricity that was known to be man and that could be produced on demand. However, certain animals, such as the torpedo fish, could generate shocks. Now, basically, many people believe that these shocks were electrical in nature. Now, lightning also looked like a much grander version of the sparks that could be made using static electricity. But nobody was sure that they were one and the same substance. That is until Benjamin Franklin made his dynamic experience and experiment. In 1750, Franklin proposed that electricity could be drawn from the clouds, that is, if there is lightning. Okay. And he did it to prove that lightning was electrical in nature. And French scientists conducted the experiment in 1752 and they confirmed Franklin's hypothesis. So, lightning storms seem to provide the backdrop for many moments in Frankenstein as well, and they have a different significance in Mary Shelley's life also. Uh, for instance, when young Victor notices in Frankenstein that a tree is being destroyed by lightning, that has a lasting impact on his own psyche, and that can be seen in this text as well. Now, in 1745, the invention of the Leyden jar, which was a simple device that could store electrical charge, it made a major upheaval because electricity could now be collected and stored and supplied on demand. Now, the voltaic pile, which we often call the first battery in the 1800s, that also gave an increased level of electrical power and a greater control over it. And it allowed the scientists to use electricity to probe the very essence of the different materials. And it also revealed a host of new elements. And the voltaic pile was also used to animate muscles in dead frogs and paraplegic humans. So now you get it. Why am I talking about science for almost 43 minutes now? Enlightenment and science, if you do not understand them, you cannot understand Frankenstein. You have to read and understand them so that you can understand Frankenstein. And basically, connections have been made between electricity and weather, electricity and materials already. Experiments on animals also revealed a strong connection between electricity and life, and therefore there was no telling what the poets or the writer's imagination could do with this potential application of chemistry, electricity in medical sciences, in the spheres of life. And this was very interesting. And medical and anatomical knowledge had stagnated in Europe for almost 1.5 millennia. For until the anatomists such as uh, Andreas Vesalius, the 16th century anatomist, he dared to explore the interior of human cadavers and document the extraordinary workings of the human body in great detail, and he basically debunked most of the theories given by Galen. Galen was a Greek scholar, and he had uh, dissected several animals, and he got the idea of the four humors. And Vesalius humored at Galen, as I have already said. So, in the 17th century, the human body was seen as an increasingly organic machine. And even the 16th century physician William Harvey's description of the heart as a pump. Now, why would somebody say that the heart is a pump unless somebody sees the heart as a machine? So it was increasingly being seen as an organic machine. And Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, therefore, is the next logical step in the progress of this process of thought. And the novel suggested that the creature could be manufactured from the parts exactly as a machine could be made to assemble and function when all its components are correctly assembled. In the second part of the 18th century, there was a fascination with the human body, and with a rising number of medical students, anatomy became essential because they hope to become medical students, and therefore they hope to become medical doctors, and therefore anatomy was necessary, absolutely necessary. Now, in Britain, legally available corpses were restricted in number, and to those teaching anatomy, they had to get it by official medical schools. Now, several individuals who were interested, they set up private schools offering a very one-to-one, a very hands-on understanding of anatomy. The source material for their students was provided by uh, a group of people who were called the Resurrection Men. They were basically grave diggers. So they would dig up graves and give those bodies to these people, and they would dissect the bodies. Now, it was such anatomy schools and graveyards that provided Mary's character Victor Frankenstein with the raw materials for his creature. Now, Mary Shelley was writing in a world which was brimming with scientific ideas, and where there were no specialization. And therefore, what happened was that the welding of these different fields like anatomy, life, chemistry, electricity, physics, etc., 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 this galvanization was bound to happen, and the sensational demonstrations on the corpses of recently hanged criminals appeared to show that electricity had the potential to reanimate the dead. This was called the phenomenon of galvanism. Now, these were discussed in private homes and fashionable gatherings as well as scientific societies, and it was the subject of conversation along with several different topics. And basically, the topic of galvanism was raised at the Villa Diodati, where Mary Shelley was inspired to write Frankenstein. But we must say something over here, that is, with such progress comes a lot of debate. And there were blank spaces as well. That is, some people believed that electricity might be similar to life force, in fact, life itself. Others believed electricity to be a chemical compound. Now, the nature and origin of life, therefore, began to be questioned towards the end of the century. Now, previously, it was a taboo almost. It was sacrilege to probe into the meaning of life and life force beyond the dogmatic veneer of the biblical interpretation, that is, the creation myth. But now, with these scientific progresses, and later with Erasmus Darwin, the physician, inventor, and grandfather to Charles Darwin, their findings made it very interesting for people like Mary Shelley to speculate in the process, to speculate on the process of how life generates itself. However, neither of the Darwins was so very progressive as to deny God absolutely, and they emphasized the power of the great first cause as the initiator for such a process. Now, Darwin even suggested that the strength of one species could evolve to result in the destruction of another. And a similar fear is expressed by Victor Frankenstein when he contemplated making a female creature as a companion for his first creation. Now, in the preface to her 1831 edition of the novel, Mary Shelley cited Darwin as an influence when she conceived Frankenstein. She recalled an experiment in spontaneous generation, that is, the apparent ability of some of the creatures to continuously come into existence without the need for parents. Now, this happened with a piece of ordinary vermicelli which was preserved under a glass case. Now, it seemed to move and show signs of life. This was unexpected for a piece of food, but was probably caused by the eggs laid by the flies, which were too tiny to be seen by the naked eye, and which were hatching maggots and so on and so forth. Now, observations of what was thought to be spontaneous generation were certainly reported, and the experiment cited by Mary was erroneously attributed to Dr. Darwin. But still, such influences were there. The scientific mind was there, and therefore, the scientific pace of the age before Mary's birth and also some decades afterwards were very exciting, extraordinary, and even terrifying. And basically, by the time that Mary was born, chemistry was no longer alchemy, and it became a very systematic, modern scientific approach. And by 1789, Lavoisier had already enlisted 33 chemical elements. By the time Mary died, a further 27 elements had been added to that list, and certain patterns were emerging out of them, which was soon to lead to the first periodic table. And there were several promises and prospects of progress. And therefore, I believe, along with several critics, that Frankenstein is a summation of the scientific achievements, the scientific fears, and the scientific hopes of its previous age, and the social and political atmosphere of the period, that is, the rise and downfall of several countries, can also be seen in the character of Victor, who is very secretive, isolated in his experiments, and he's trying to find newfound lands. His investigations uh, are into the territories unknown to man. Now, therefore, the Enlightenment can also be seen as a marked change in attitude towards education, towards science, towards nature, towards the universe, and towards the religious dogmatism. And therefore, what happens is that this led to several promises. This led to uh, several people postulating several things and publication. So, what happens is that in the early 19th century, Jane Marset's series of conversations was published, which were books on discussions between two young pupils, Caroline and Mary, and their teacher, Mrs. Bryant, and they became very popular. Marset's books, illustrated with sketches of scientific equipments drawn by herself, guided her readers through the basics of physics, astronomy, chemistry, and botany, with the teacher figure encouraging her young pupils to question, discuss, and share their ideas. Now, although this inspired imitators and plagiarists, her books remained as the standards. And we will see the characters like Michael Faraday, who was a young fan. And Faraday took a great leap in educating the common people, whereas Marset's notion was in educating young girls. And her notion was that women should be knowledgeable in the chemical sciences for the social advantage. And Erasmus Darwin, during this period, he set up a girls' school. And in this school, the first two subjects which were added was chemistry and botany. James Watt, the Scottish engineer, he corresponded with his wife, uh, and they included several technological details. And even Lavoisier's own young wife, Mary Anne, learned English so she could translate the papers from the Royal Society and other works by English scientists for her husband. And she became the secretary to her husband. In 1787, Caroline Herschel uh, became the first woman in Britain to receive a salary, a professional salary for scientific work, which was awarded to her by King George III. And she was known as the Comet Hunter. Now, many women, therefore, you see, in Mary Shelley's time, were coming to the forefront, trying to understand science. They were scientists in their own right. And Mary Shelley, when she talks about Frankenstein, she takes the spirits of all these women, she takes the voices of all these women in constructing a novel which rightly takes its place in the history of English literature as the first work of science fiction where science comes first and fiction comes later. Therefore, we still read it today. So today I talked in general about science and enlightenment. There will be more lectures following soon. So hope to see you and have a good day. Thank you so much. If you have any questions, put them in the comment section and I'll answer. Okay. Bye bye. Have a good day.